Hello. In this section, we're going to talk about some of the things that help make for a modern Korean identity by looking at its ancient roots. We'll look first at the indigenous origins and then at China and its influences on Korea. But this person here, named Tangun, is considered kind of the origin of the Korean people. He's considered the divine ancestor of the Korean people. Now, what do we mean by divine? Well, Tangun has very interesting parents. His father was the son of God, and his mother was a bear who wanted to become a human, and the son of God helped her become a human, and then they had Tangun, right? So he's considered a kind of divine figure because he's got a divine dad, and his mother, of course, is also special because she had been a bear at one time. So I think a very fascinating story, but it's basically saying we Koreans are a special people with a special origin, different fundamentally from other human beings. Now, he goes on then to establish a government, what's called the Old Chosun now, right? So he establishes a government. And the story goes that he established this government in the year 2333 BC. So with some creative rounding, Koreans use this to claim that they have a 5,000-year-old history. He's also said to have ruled for 1,500 years. And this is kind of considered the beginnings of the Korean people. Now, a lot of this, many Koreans would say it's a myth, but even though they understand it's a myth, to varying degrees, they also see it as history. So you could have a Korean person who says, well, I don't really think we're descended from a god or anything like that, but I do think we had developed this early ancient state, and we had this really great king, and we are a people that are 5,000 years old. You might also have Koreans who say, no, it totally happened like this, and we worship Tangun as our founder. So there's differing understandings of this, but to an extent, if you talk to a Korean about Tangun, they're going to say, oh yeah, that's our ancient ancestor. So very important even to this day. There's also something interesting too about the story of Tangun, is it shows us how Korean identity was tied to a state ruled by a monarchy. It's almost, at the beginning of their being Koreans, there was a government. And it's kind of hard to think of Koreans existing outside of a Korean government. So there's a strong emphasis on the identity of the Korean people being tied to membership in a state ruled by a king. Another aspect of it is religious. You can see here the influence of animism. If you're not familiar with that term, it's this kind of idea that the natural world is inhabited by spirits, right? Because you have this bear that can talk, right, and gets turned into a human. And you also have the idea of shamanism, which is a belief that human beings are able to communicate with spirits, especially that you have these special shamans, people with a special gift to communicate with spirits. And Tangun is often seen as kind of an early shaman because of his connection to his father, who is the son of God, who Koreans saw as being someone who came down from the sky, from heaven. But you can see these basic ideas here. And many shamans today in Korea still follow Tangun and see him as a divine figure who guides them in their practice. And if you go to a Buddhist temple, a lot of times there'll be a little shrine dedicated to Tangun. I'm not sure why he's always pictured with a tiger, considering that it was the bear that became a human. I always find that interesting. And it's curious too, because Koreans tend to emphasize with tigers. The motto, or the Korea National University, for example, its mascot is a tiger, and Koreans argue that their country looks like a leaping tiger. The tail's in the north, the head's in the south. I don't know why they emphasize the tiger when they're descended from a bear, but it's kind of a curious issue. In any case, one thing also I need to emphasize about this, though, is that the place where Koreans believe that Tangun descended is in Baekdusan, Mount Baekdu, and it's this beautiful place in North Korea on the Chinese border. Is gorgeous. Like if a god's going to descend, it would be in a place like this, I think, right? It's beautiful, and it does feel kind of otherworldly. What's interesting, of course, is that it's in North Korean territory, and North Koreans claim that, Kim Jong-il, the father of Kim Jong-un, was born here, and they claim to have found Tangun's body, which I think is interesting. So you can see how Koreans today especially in the north, are trying to tie themselves back to this legend. So that's why, even though this is modern Korea, we have to start talking about this ancient stuff. Now, Korea wasn't just about indigenous beliefs, right? There's also a connection to China that's very ancient. So Tongun, of course, eventually left, right? He doesn't die, if I recall correctly. He just goes back to heaven. And he needs a successor to rule Koreans because they have a state. And some claim the successor was a man named Gija, who was a refugee from the Chinese Zhou dynasty. So it's interesting that Koreans claim that at one time they were ruled by a Chinese person. Now, I want to stress they weren't a part of China. It was just this guy was a refugee and he became their successor. And this neatly connects this idea for Koreans, at least in the ancient period, that they had these kind of two identities, one influenced by China, but one that was also indigenous. And for a smaller country like Korea, it's very important to understand this dynamic, this idea of taking outside influence, bringing it into the country, and creatively interacting with it. But some claim that, like I said, that his successor was Gija. Now, historically, there are some records for that. It's hard to tell. But one thing we do know was that during the Han Dynasty in China, in northern Korea, they established what are called commandaries. These are basically like military colonies. So China was establishing military colonies in northern Korea. And this gave Koreans, or the people who would become to be known as Koreans, whether they thought themselves as Koreans or not is questionable, but they would adopt elements of Chinese civilization. So you have people who are going to be connected or, in conversation with Chinese, and they will adopt elements of Chinese civilization. They'll start borrowing writing, right? Koreans did not have an indigenous form of writing, so they just borrowed Chinese writing. They will develop their own, they will borrow a Chinese system of government, focusing on a monarchy, and I won't go into it, but they will organize their government in a Chinese way. They will adopt Confucianism. And so Koreans will very much become a part, in a sense, of Chinese Confucian civilization. But when the Han Dynasty becomes weak, they will drive out the Chinese and form independent states. So it's interesting because Koreans will increasingly consider themselves a part of Chinese civilization, or what they would just call civilization, but they will also maintain their independence. So like I say, it's this very fascinating dynamic where Koreans have their own indigenous tradition. They quite openly borrow from the outside world, but they also fiercely assert their own political independence.